We don't have time for this junk.
Those medals are not junk. They're the weight of every promise this country has ever made, and you will treat them as such.
They thought they could treat an old man's medals like scrap, just another inconvenience to toss aside. They didn't see the silent weight of those medals, the quiet honor behind them. He threw away a veteran's medals, but the Secretary of Defense made sure he paid the price. Subscribe to Endless Stories and share this video, because some debts are never paid in gold or medals, but in the quiet echo of respect that cannot be silenced. The line at the security checkpoint snaked in slow, tired coils. The morning rush had given way to a hush of quiet tension. Laptops in bins, shoes off, belts clinking into plastic trays. Travelers moved like sleepwalkers, each step a silent prayer that they'd be through and on their way soon. The old man stepped forward, his shoulders straight despite the wear of the years. His worn brown coat was buttoned up tight against the winter chill still clinging to the glass doors behind him. In his hands, he carried a small wooden box, old, polished by time and the quiet rub of his thumb along its edge. He set it carefully on the conveyor belt, the wood gleaming softly under the harsh airport lights. The TSA agent on duty barely looked up, his jaw tight with boredom as he barked orders at the line. "Sir, step forward. Arms out. Feet apart." The old man did as he was told, the quiet dignity of a man who had spent his life following orders he didn't always agree with. His face was lined with years of service, but his eyes were bright, watchful. The agent gave him a once-over, then turned his attention to the box. He flipped the latch open carelessly, the contents clinking softly in protest. Inside were medals, neat rows of brass and ribbon, each one a story of a life spent standing in the quiet spaces between the noise. The agent's lips twitched, a small, dismissive smirk. "What's all this junk?" he muttered, his voice dripping with the indifference of someone who'd never had to earn the weight of such things. The old man said nothing. His hands stayed at his sides, but his shoulders stiffened just a little, the only sign that he had heard. The agent picked up a medal, the bronze star dulled by years but still glinting in the harsh light, and let it drop carelessly back into the box. The soft clink of metal on wood was a small, quiet insult. Then he tipped the box, letting the medals spill out onto the gray plastic bin, as though they were nothing more than trinkets bought at a thrift store. "Keep it moving," he said, shoving the bin forward. "We've got a line here." The old man watched, his eyes steady, his mouth set in a thin line. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply reached down, his hands careful and sure, gathering each medal with the same quiet reverence he had shown when he'd first earned them. And in the hush of that checkpoint, in the soft scrape of metal on plastic, in the low murmur of voices that had grown suddenly quieter, something shifted. Because some things, even when dropped, refused to be forgotten. The medals lay in the bin like fallen leaves, the glint of brass and ribbon dulled by the scuffed plastic. Around them, the line moved on. People pulling shoes back on, repacking laptops, heads ducked low against the morning rush. But in the small hush that had settled around the old man, no one quite met his gaze. He didn't look up at the TSA agent. He didn't say a word. He just reached out, his hands steady despite the tremor in his knuckles, and gathered each medal one by one. The faint tap of metal on metal was the only sound, a quiet music that echoed far louder than any shout. The agent shifted uncomfortably, his smirk faltering. He looked around, as if hoping someone would back him up, but the hush had grown deeper. Even the soft murmur of the conveyor belt seemed to pause, the low rattle of rolling bins stilled by the gravity of the moment. The old man's fingers paused on the last medal, a silver star, the ribbon frayed at the edges. His thumb brushed the tarnished metal, and for a moment his eyes softened, the weight of memory in the set of his shoulders. He took a slow breath and straightened, his movements calm, deliberate. Then he closed the box, the soft click of the latch a final word he didn't need to say out loud. He didn't protest. He didn't argue. He didn't give the agent the noise he seemed to be waiting for. Instead, he stood there, still and quiet, the medals now gathered in his hands once more. And in that silence, the small line of travelers who had witnessed the scene shifted, their eyes flicking to the agent and then back to the old man. Something hard and bright settled in the air, the kind of respect that couldn't be demanded, only earned. The agent swallowed, the edge of his smirk gone. But he said nothing. He turned back to the conveyor belt, his hands moving with mechanical precision as he called for the next traveler. The old man didn't move right away. He let the silence stretch, his breath slow and sure. And in that hush, he offered no apology for the metals that clinked softly in his box, no explanation for the quiet stand he had just taken. Because some battles didn't need to be fought with fists or shouts. Some were fought in the soft refusal to let the world decide what was worth remembering. The line at the checkpoint had grown still, a hush settling in like a held breath. Travelers shifted, their feet scuffing the floor, but their eyes stayed on the old man as he tucked the box of metals carefully under his arm. A young couple stood near the edge of the security area, their hands intertwined. The woman's eyes were wide, her mouth tight with something like anger. She reached out, touching her partner's arm as if to say, "Did you see that? Did you see what he did?" A boy, no more than 10, clutched a stuffed bear to his chest. He looked up at the old man with the quiet awe of someone who hadn't yet learned how to hide respect behind indifference. His mother put a gentle hand on his shoulder, her gaze locked on the old man's calm face. And then there was the young man, a veteran himself though still in civilian clothes. His jacket was plain, but the faint outline of a unit patch still clung to the fabric. He watched the old man with a steady gaze, his own breath slowing as the weight of the moment settled into his chest. The TSA agent pretended not to notice, his movements brisk and mechanical as he scanned the next traveler's bag. But the line of his shoulders was tight, the corner of his jaw twitching with the quiet knowledge that the hush around him was not on his side. The young veteran took a slow breath, his hand tightening on the phone in his pocket. He didn't know the old man's name, didn't know the stories behind the metals that had been treated like junk. But he knew the weight of respect, the quiet debt he owed to every man who had walked that road before him. He pulled out his phone and stepped away from the line, his voice low but certain as he spoke. "Sir," he said quietly, "I just saw a veteran's medals tossed aside like garbage at the checkpoint. Someone needs to see this." The person on the other end didn't ask questions. They didn't need to, because there were some stories that didn't need to be told twice. The young veteran's eyes flicked back to the old man, the soft, unwavering set of his shoulders. And in that moment he made a silent promise. "I will not let this be forgotten, because respect wasn't something you asked for. It was something you stood for, in the hush of a security line, in the quiet refusal to let the weight of a man's life be tossed aside like an afterthought." The young veteran stepped into a quiet alcove near the boarding gates, his phone pressed to his ear. The line rang only once before a low, steady voice answered. "Captain Ellis," the voice said. "What's the situation?" Ellis took a breath, his eyes flicking back to the checkpoint where the old man still stood, metals now gathered in a careful bundle in his hands. "It's Sergeant Avery," he said quietly. "Vietnam vet from the look of him." TSA agent tossed his medals like trash. No respect, no apology. "Sir, it was—" He paused, swallowing the flicker of anger that burned at the back of his throat. "It was disgraceful." There was a pause on the other end of the line, the silence of someone who understood exactly what those medals meant, even without seeing them. "Where are you?" the voice asked, calm but clipped. "Gate B," Ellis said. "Reagan National Airport. It happened maybe 5 minutes ago." "Understood," the voice said. "I'll take it from here. Stay close, Captain." Ellis ended the call and slipped his phone back into his pocket. He turned, his eyes scanning the line of travelers who still watched the old man. Some with quiet respect, others with the shame of those who had seen too much and done too little. The TSA agent kept his head down, eyes fixed on the next traveler's bag as if the quiet hush around him was nothing more than an inconvenience. But the hush didn't fade. It held, solid and certain. A small stand in the middle of a busy airport. Ellis took a slow breath, his shoulders straightening. He walked back to the checkpoint, his steps steady, each one a quiet promise that this would not be forgotten. As he drew closer, the old man looked up, their eyes meeting in the hush. Ellis gave him a small, respectful nod. Not loud, not showy. Just a quiet acknowledgement of what the man had carried and what he had refused to let be taken. The old man nodded back the smallest of gestures. But it was enough. Because in the soft hush of an airport security line, something had shifted. And it was only the beginning. It didn't take long for word to spread. In the age of instant messages and viral clips, the moment, the quiet insult, the silent stand was already finding its way into the small corners of the internet. A young woman waiting by the gate, phone in hand, had recorded the scene. She posted it with a short caption. They tossed his medals like trash, but he didn't flinch. He just stood. It was enough. In minutes, the video had been shared, liked, and reposted. Words of anger mixed with quiet tributes, strangers writing lines of respect for a man whose name they didn't know, but whose dignity spoke louder than any headline. Emily, the gate agent at a nearby terminal, saw the video as it flashed across her phone. She paused, her breath catching as she watched the quiet power of the old man's stand. She had seen him come through her line before, always polite, always quiet. She had never known the weight he carried in that small wooden box. She didn't hesitate. She reached for the phone at the check-in desk, her voice low but urgent. "I need to speak with the duty manager," she said. "This isn't right." Across the terminal, the same words echoed in different ways, whispers of outrage, of solidarity, of a respect that didn't need to shout to be heard. The hush that had settled around the old man in that moment was growing, spreading outward like ripples in still water. At the checkpoint, the TSA agent's shoulders hunched a little more, the weight of that quiet respect pressing down on him even though no one raised their voice. And the old man. He stood steady in the center of it all, the box of medals clutched in his hands. He didn't look at the phones or the stairs. He just breathed slow and sure, the same calm he had carried through battles that had taken so much more than this. Because in the end, it wasn't about the noise. It was about the quiet power of a man who knew that dignity wasn't something you demanded. It was something you carried. And somewhere in the hush of the spreading rumors, the soft echo of that stand reached the ears of those who had the power to answer. 10 minutes. That was all it took. A hush settled over the terminal as a convoy of black SUVs pulled up to the curb, their engines a low, steady growl that cut through the low murmur of airport chatter. Dark-suited men stepped out first, security details with earpieces and sharp eyes. Then, from the rear car, a tall man emerged, his coat flapping in the winter breeze. The Secretary of Defense. His presence was quiet but absolute, the kind of authority that didn't need an introduction. He paused at the curb, his eyes sweeping the entrance, the long glass doors reflecting the winter light. He didn't hurry. He didn't have to. The hush around him was as complete as the silence that had settled in the old man's eyes. Inside the terminal, Emily at the gate desk swallowed hard, her breath catching as she watched the secretary stride across the tile. The line at security stilled, the travelers parting like water before him. Even the TSA agent at the checkpoint paused, his fingers frozen mid-scan, his smirk replaced by a tight line of unease. The secretary didn't glance at the agent. His eyes found the old man first, the medal still clutched in his hands, the quiet dignity in the set of his shoulders. He walked straight to him, his steps deliberate and calm. "Sergeant," the secretary said, his voice low but resonant in the hush. "May I?" He held out his hand, palm up, a simple gesture of respect. The old man's eyes met his, and for a moment time seemed to slow. Then he placed the small wooden box, the medals he had fought to keep, into the secretary's waiting hand. The secretary held the box like it was made of glass, his fingers brushing the worn wood with the care of a man who understood the weight of service. He turned to the TSA agent, his voice even but sharp as the edge of a blade. "These are not trinkets," he said softly, but every word was a hammer. "These are the quiet echo of a man's life, and you treated them like garbage." The hush deepened. The young veteran, Ellis, watched with a quiet pride in his chest. The boy with the stuffed bear squeezed his mother's hand tighter. And in the soft, unbroken hush, something shifted in the way everyone in that terminal breathed. Because respect wasn't about noise. It was about the quiet stand of a man who had given everything, and the calm, unwavering promise of those who would never let that be forgotten. The TSA agent swallowed hard as the secretary's words settled into the hush like a quiet storm. He tried to speak, to find some explanation, some apology, but the words wouldn't come. Not in the face of that calm, unwavering gaze. "You disrespected a veteran," the secretary said, his voice low but sure, each word a quiet echo of judgment. "You disrespected every man and woman who has ever carried the weight of these medals." The agent shifted his feet, his shoulders hunched under the weight of the stairs around him. I was just doing my job," he stammered. "No," the secretary said simply. "You were doing something else entirely." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The steel in his tone was enough. He turned slightly, his eyes finding the old man, who watched with the same calm, steady dignity he had carried through every moment of this long morning. The secretary inclined his head, the smallest of bows. "Sergeant," he said softly, "you didn't have to say a word. Your stand spoke for you." The old man said nothing. He didn't need to. The faint line of a smile touched the corners of his mouth. Not of triumph, but of quiet relief that someone had seen him, had understood. The secretary turned back to the agent, his gaze cool. "You will file a report," he said. "You will explain every detail of what happened here today. And you will remember that respect is not optional. Not in this uniform, not in this country." The agent nodded, his face pale. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice shaking. The hush around them grew even deeper, the line of travelers still and silent as they watched the weight of consequence settle into the small, bright world of the checkpoint. Ellis, the young veteran, let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing as he watched the scene unfold. He didn't know the old man's name, but in that moment, in the quiet calm of the secretary's voice and the faint, steady pride in the veteran's eyes, he understood that some stands didn't need to be shouted. They only needed to be seen. The air in the terminal seemed to hum with the weight of the moment. Travelers stood still, their conversations forgotten, their eyes fixed on the quiet confrontation at the checkpoint. Even the beeping of the scanners felt distant, muffled by the quiet gravity that had taken hold. The secretary turned back to the old man, the medals still cradled carefully in his hands. He took a slow breath, his eyes softening. "Sergeant," he said, his voice low and steady, "you deserve better than this. You've earned better than this." The old man's shoulders eased slightly, the faintest flicker of relief in his eyes. "It's not for me," he said softly. "It's for the ones who didn't come home. These aren't just pieces of metal. They're the quiet echoes of those who stood beside me." The secretary nodded once, the weight of that truth settling into the quiet hush around them. "And they will be treated with the respect they deserve," he said firmly. "I will see to it myself." He turned back to the TSA agent, his gaze sharp. "You will be held accountable," he said. "But more than that, you will remember. You will remember that behind every medal is a story that matters. A life that was given or nearly given in service to something bigger than yourself." The agent swallowed, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. The secretary inclined his head, the small motion final and certain. Then he turned back to the old man, his expression softening again. "May I?" he asked, holding out the medals with both hands. The old man took them back slowly, his fingers brushing the cool metal, the weight of each one settling into his palm like an old friend. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for seeing me." "It's not just you I see," the secretary said. "It's every man and woman who carried that weight and didn't ask for thanks. You remind us all what it means to stand." A hush fell again, deeper this time. Not of shock, but of quiet respect. The line at security moved slower now, each traveler a little more aware of the weight carried in the silence between footsteps. Ellis stood a little taller, his breath easier in his chest. The young couple held hands tighter. Even the boy with the stuffed bear seemed to understand, his wide eyes solemn as he watched the old man tuck the medals back into their box. Because some stands didn't need to be loud. They only needed to be seen. The secretary turned to the crowd that had gathered. Travelers, airport staff, and the silent ranks of those who had come to bear witness to a moment that felt like something bigger than an inconvenience at a security checkpoint. His gaze swept the small sea of faces, each one reflecting a mixture of outrage and quiet respect. He cleared his throat, the sound low and certain in the hush. "I know many of you saw what happened here today," he said. "I want you to remember this. No medal, no uniform, no story of service is ever just an object to be tossed aside." His words settled into the quiet like a benediction, the kind that didn't need volume to carry its weight. The secretary turned back to the old man, his expression softening as he drew in a breath. "I owe you an apology, Sergeant," he said, "for every time someone looked past your sacrifice, for every time someone forgot the cost of these medals." The old man didn't speak at first. He stood there, the wooden box cradled against his chest, the hush of the terminal wrapping around him like a gentle cloak. Then he nodded once, the small motion enough to say, "I accept." The secretary inclined his head in return. "It shouldn't have taken this," he said quietly. "But today at least we remember." He reached out then, his hand closing over the old man's shoulder. Not a politician's pat, but the firm, steady grip of a soldier who understood the language of service. The old man's shoulders straightened under that touch, his chin lifting just a fraction. The travelers watched in silence, no applause, no cheering. Just a quiet breath that seemed to echo in every chest. This is what respect looks like. Ellis stepped forward then, the young veteran's eyes steady. He met the old man's gaze and gave a small, solemn nod, a promise that he, too, would carry the memory of what he'd seen here. The secretary let go of the old man's shoulder and took a step back, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Thank you," he said, "for your service, for your silence, and for reminding us all what it means to stand." The hush of the terminal seemed to deepen, not the hush of fear or shock, but the hush of reverence. And in that breathless quiet, the world seemed to remember the weight of the medals in the old man's hands. Because some debts weren't paid in words. They were paid in the quiet, unwavering breath of a man who refused to be moved, and the soft, certain echo of a promise that would not be broken. The hush held as the secretary stepped back, his hand dropping to his side. The old man clutched the box of medals to his chest, his eyes glinting in the bright lights of the terminal. He took a breath, slow and deep, as if drawing strength from the moment, from the quiet promise that had been kept. Around him, the line of travelers shifted slowly back into motion, but their steps were softer, their voices hushed. A young woman pressed a hand to her chest, her lips parted in a small, reverent smile. A man in a business suit paused, his eyes thoughtful as he watched the old man stand taller than any uniform could have made him. Ellis approached, his own breath steady, his shoulders squared. He didn't speak, didn't need to. He reached out, offering his hand, and the old man took it with a quiet strength. The clasp was brief but certain, a silent bridge across generations of men who had learned that dignity wasn't something you shouted. It was something you lived. "Thank you," Ellis said softly, "for reminding me what that looks like." The old man's lips curved in a faint, tired smile. "It's not about me," he said. "It never was. It's about the ones who never made it home. About making sure we remember." Ellis nodded, his eyes glinting. "We will," he said. "I promise." The secretary turned to the TSA agent, his expression cool but not unkind. "You have a choice," he said quietly, "to learn from this, or to let it fade." The agent swallowed hard, his eyes dropping as he nodded. A small, uncertain promise to do better. And then, like the soft release of a held breath, the moment began to fade back into the quiet rhythm of the terminal. The world moved on, flights to catch, lives to live. But something had shifted. In the hush of that confrontation, the echo of respect had found a place to settle. The old man turned to leave, Bear padding at his side, his head held high and his gaze steady. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The promise had been made, not just by the secretary, but by every quiet breath that had been held in that hush. Because some debts were never paid in medals or in words. They were paid in the soft, steady stand of those who refused to forget, and in the quiet echo that lived on long after the noise had faded. As he stepped out into the winter air, the cold biting at his cheeks, the old man drew in a long, slow breath. And in that breath, he carried the weight of every medal in that box, not as a burden, but as a quiet, unbreakable promise. And the world, for a moment at least, remembered, thank you for joining this journey. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that some voices are quiet but never weak, please subscribe to Endless Stories and share this video. Because some debts are paid not in medals, but in the quiet breath of those who stand.